Everyone is on edge, and who can blame them? It started with Jason 2 weeks back. He just vanished one night and never came back, leaving his wife and daughters alone and devastated. Rumours spread through the town like wildfire. Some claimed Jason had run off with another woman, while others claimed his debts had likely caught up with him. Of course, this was all speculation, and nobody had any real answers. But this was just the beginning. Next to go was Tommy a few days later. He was a retired gentleman who lived alone, so it took a little while for anyone to even realise that he was gone. His friends confirmed his disappearance after he never showed up for a routine pool night. They visited his home to try and get some answers, but could find nothing that implied where he might have gone. Curiously, his door was left wide open, just like Jason's was. Since these disappearances, a further 4 have gone missing, all men. Nobody can seem to find a link between all of the disappearances other than the gender, which may just be chance. Not all the men knew each other, and they were of different ages and lived in different parts of the town. It was a mystery to be sure. Police searched everywhere they could in our town, but with a lack of personnel, they didn't have the resources to search any further afield. I heard they were trying to get in some outside help, but so far no one has shown up to assist. Naturally, people are scared and angry that the police aren't doing more, so we decided to hold a town meeting to discuss the situation. It seemed more like a coping mechanism than anything, as nobody knew what to do. We presumed the missing people were dead, and anyone could be next. As a precautionary measure, everyone agreed to travel around in pairs, and whistles were handed out to those who would take them. If anything sinister occurred, a strong blow of the whistle would notify anyone in the immediate area, allowing them to help. Just as the meeting was about to conclude, a strange man wearing a cowboy hat entered the room. He looked to be about 65 years old, had a beard and stern features, and was smoking a cigar.
"Hear you've been having some disappearances of late,"
the man announced. Nobody spoke for a second, before Vincent, the town vicar, spoke up. "We sure have, sir. Do you know anything about the disappearances?"
"Sure do. Any of you heard singing coming from the forest?"
"What on earth does singing have to do with this?" Before the strange man could respond, another interjected. Yes, I think I heard some distant singing a few nights back."
"Figured so,"
the man said, stroking his beard and taking another puff of his cigar, allowing his comment to sink in among the group.
"What you've got here is a siren," the man exclaimed. "Supernatural beastie that lures people away with its angelic voice."
This caused quite a stir among the group, as people were annoyed at such a ridiculous explanation that was clearly a lie. The vicar hushed the people down and took charge once more. "Stop trying to rile everyone up," he said. "They're desperate, and your lies are not helping."
"Ain't no lies," the man argued. "Let me ask you this. Only men been disappearing, am I right?"
The group fell silent. Nobody knew what to say. The man filled the silence by explaining further.
"Sirens only go after men, you see. Your women here ain't at risk."
A uniform exhale of relief followed from most of the women in the group. None believed the explanation beforehand, but they clutched to it once their safety was assured. Nonsensical shouting erupted from the men. When they had settled down somewhat, a man from the middle of the group shouted, "We don't believe any of your horse shits. Get on out of here, else there's going to be trouble." The strange man calmly took off his cowboy hat and gave a nod.
"Believe what you want. Just passing through to give you a warning's all. Whether you act on it is up to you."
He turned to leave and began to walk to the door. At this point, I decided to speak up for the first time. "Suppose we do believe what you're saying is the truth. How do we protect ourselves?" The man stopped in his tracks and peered over his shoulder.
"Simple. Block out the sound. Earplugs, headphones, whatever. The siren will move on soon enough. Just gotta wait it out."
He then opened the door and left. It was the last we ever saw of him. I tried to convince the group to listen to the man. Even if he was lying, wearing headphones was no real inconvenience. Yet only a few people listened to me. When night fell, I went back to the house. I grabbed my headphones and put on an 8-hour-long playlist. That should get me through the night, I thought. Upon passing my brother's open door, I was alarmed to see him in bed with no headphones or earplugs. "What do you think you're doing?" I shouted.
"Going to sleep," he groaned.
"Did you not hear the man from earlier?" I responded. "You need to wear some headphones."
"Do you really believe that crap?" he argued. "I'm not wearing anything."
I couldn't believe how dismissive he was, but I knew arguing any further was a waste of time. He'd made up his mind. I threw a stress ball from his desk at him as I left. "Stupid idiot," I muttered, before getting into bed. I cranked up the music on my phone and soon fell off to sleep. I was suddenly awoken some hours later to the sound of something falling in my brother's room. I quickly rushed over just as he was exiting. Why was he up? Something didn't feel right. I ran round to the other side of him to block his path. "Where are you going?" I asked. He said nothing. His mouth was open and he was drooling, but he continued to walk forward. I pushed him back and he fell to the ground. "Stop, Rich," I said. "You heard the siren, didn't you?" He remained silent and slowly got to his feet, attempting to continue onward. It looked like he was in some kind of trance. He kept trying to leave the house. Fortunately for me, he wasn't aggressive, just persistent. This made it easy for me to restrain him. I tied him to a radiator using a couple of hoodies. With him secure, I tried to free his mind, yet whatever I did, I just couldn't snap him out of it. I tried playing music, slapping him, hell, I even tried giving him smelling salts, but nothing could break the hold the siren had on him. At this point, I was completely convinced that the strange man who appeared in town was telling the truth. When morning rolled around, I was woken up again, but this time to Rich yelling at me. "Why am I tied to a radiator? What the hell did you do?" he shouted. Rubbing my eyes, I explained, "Don't you remember anything from last night? You didn't wear headphones like I asked, and you were entranced by the siren, just like I said you would be." "Not this bollocks again," he responded. Try as I might to convince him, I couldn't. My mother thought I was just as crazy, but it didn't bother me all that much. I'd saved Rich, and that's all that really mattered. I was just as useless at convincing others in town of what occurred the previous night. Many gave me strange looks, so I quickly gave up on the endeavour. My attention instead turned to what I should do going forward. Knowing that the town was plagued by a siren, I had to do something to stop anyone else from being taken. My first step was identifying what could hurt a siren on the internet. The best thing, it seemed, was a bronze dagger. Unfortunately, there weren't any of those lying around. Yet there was a bronze statue in my living room of a stag with sharp antlers. That's basically a dagger, I thought, taking it and stashing it in my bag. The next step was coming up with a plan to get to the siren without being entranced. I switched out my headphones for earbuds, as these were a little less obvious. Didn't want the siren to know I wasn't under her spell. The plan was to stalk whoever was the next victim and tail him back to the siren. I'd then promptly restrain him, take his place, and stab the siren with the statue. What could go wrong? A whole lot, I imagined, but I didn't have any choice but to follow the plan. When night fell, I slid open my window, careful to not make a sound, and rappelled down the building using a makeshift rope out of bedsheets. I couldn't risk taking the front door as the floorboards are old and creaky. I then hurried to the edge of the forest, as that was where the old man said the siren was based. From here, I'd spot anyone from the town who was heading this way. I waited for several hours, and at one point I was convinced that this night we got off lucky. That was when I spotted Mr. Abraham, a lawyer, approaching in his pajamas. I knew from the experience with my brother that those who were entranced pay no attention to anyone else. This meant I could safely follow beside Mr. Abraham so that I could quickly restrain him when the time came. We traipsed through the forest for about 15 minutes. It was at this point I noticed Mr. Abraham was sporting a comforting smile on his face. We must be getting close, I thought. I tried looking on ahead, but the trees were so thick that I could only see 80 meters or so in front of me, so I continued onward, tensely following. We skirted around a particularly wide tree, and that's when I saw her. She was beautiful, perhaps the most beautiful person I'd ever seen. It took a second for me to realize why I was here. I quickly yanked Mr. Abraham back and put him in a rear naked choke, just like I'd seen those MMA fighters do. It seemed to work well enough. This made it easier to bind his hands and wrists. He wasn't going anywhere. I then took a second to compose myself, half opened the zipper on my backpack, and took the place of Mr. Abraham, pretending I was under the siren's spell. As I grew near, she lovingly motioned me to approach with her majestic hands. Her presence was intoxicating, and I struggled to maintain my thoughts, even though I couldn't hear her singing. A few meters away now, she turned and began walking to lead me somewhere. As we walked, she frequently turned to face me, ensuring I was still under her spell. At first, I was too worried to try and attack. She was supernatural after all, but the lives of others rested on my effort, so I had to take action. As soon as her gaze left mine and she turned to face forward, I quietly drew the bronze statue from my backpack, leaped forward, and swung it forcefully toward her neck. To my shock, she somehow reacted to my attack, lifting her right arm with lightning speed. This caused the antlers of the statue to plunge into her arm, likely saving her life. Panicked, I released the statue, and it fell to the floor. She turned to me and hissed like a defensive puma and took off running. For a moment, I stood there, not knowing what to do. but my path was clear. I had to follow her to finish what I started. Catching up to her proved almost impossible. She moved with such speed and grace that it was clear she was no regular woman. Thankfully, the forest cleared as I started to lose my breath, revealing a large lake. Around 200 meters in front, I watched her dive in and begin swimming. Determined, I pressed onward and leaped into the lake and began violently swimming to catch up with her. After a short time, I realized I was getting no closer, and by sheer luck, I accidentally kept my eyes open as I submerged my head. Terror overwhelmed me, and I felt goosebumps all over. Floating beneath the surface were the missing bodies. She'd lured the men out here to drown. I looked up in dread. The siren was nowhere to be seen. I quickly turned around and beelined it back to land, swimming faster than I ever had before. My arms and legs screamed as lactic acid built up in them, but I had no choice but to ignore the pain. Relenting to it would mean my doom. As I battled onward, I expected to be dragged to the depths at any moment, but nothing clutched at my ankles. Somehow, despite my swimming technique reverting to little more than a flailing mess, I made it to solid ground. I collapsed in a state of total exhaustion and looked back at the still lake. Just 10 meters from me, the siren's head slowly emerged from the water's surface before sinking. I stayed there for a few minutes, but the siren didn't reappear, so I journeyed back home. The following day I was silent about my escapade. I knew nobody would believe it, so why waste the words? As expected, nobody was noted to be missing, which was a relief. The same was true the following week. In fact, there were no more disappearances at all. Eventually, neighbouring police helped expand our search for the missing men, and they were found in the lake. The case was never solved, as police couldn't explain why the men drowned in the lake, which was expected, as there was no logical reason for it. It was purely supernatural. It seemed the strange man was right about everything, even that the siren would eventually pass on, but whether it was a natural migration or a result of my intervention, I'll never know.